All right, well, we're back. We're back. The lovely realities of in-person events and having technical difficulties. So my name is Erika Cheung. I am the co-host with Elena for this conference. We were really excited to sort of convene people together from diverse backgrounds to really discuss these issues that we're seeing in ethical AI development and also figure out what are the possibilities of solutions. So there we go. So I kind of wanted to start off and pose a question to you guys. If you look at these 4 pictures, what are some of the things that come to mind? Any comments? Corruption, what else do we got? Fraud, I saw whispers of fraud. Anything else? Convicts, yeah, people who were indicted. So these cases were some of the biggest collapses that we've seen across the world, really. Wirecard was here in Germany. We had Sam Bankman-Fried, who I think technically was Bahamas, but probably more American than Bahamian. We had Theranos and Enron, both in the States. But I think one thing that was really striking, all these collapses were billion-dollar companies. They were leaders in their field. But one of the things that I think people don't understand is that these were some of the most innovative companies in their spaces. Theranos was going to revolutionize blood diagnostics. Sam Bankman-Fried was in the crypto space. And so there was just this element with all of these companies that they were innovative leaders. And so I kind of wanted to sort of unpack a little bit with you guys, looking at some of these cautionary tales. What can we learn in terms of what are some of the ethical challenges and risks that might come up running or working with companies that are in innovative spaces? So as people have alluded to, my claim to fame is when I was 23 years old, I whistle-blew one of the big corporate frauds in the United States, which was Theranos. The company had raised $700 million at a $9 billion valuation. They were effectively testing patients with faulty technology and putting the lives of patients at risk. I was a regulatory whistleblower and a media whistleblower. And because of my report, it ended up shutting down their patient labs, so they weren't able to process patient samples. And what you would think was one of the greatest days, which was the day of justice, which was me testifying in the federal trial, where everyone was sort of claiming that this was this great thing that I had done, and we were starting to see justice. The CEO and the COO were being convicted of fraud, both wire and patient fraud. It was actually probably one of my lowest points in my life. The whole process took about 10 years, and I have to say, at this final throw, it was incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. I had started my career quite young. I was a very precocious, very prodigal kind of kid. I was homeschooled at 10 to help my family take care of my siblings. I had graduated high school with a 2-year college degree. I'd gone to Berkeley, and I'd sort of joined this company because I thought I was a part of this new revolutionary movement for diagnostics where I was going to change the world. And 10 years after the acceptance of that letter, I found myself kind of in shambles. And so this made me really reflect on what's kind of going on here. Here I had this instance of accountability and injustice, and we sort of definitely stopped this horrible collapse from happening. But it made me wonder kind of, what were the cost of some of this, and what could be done better in the future. So I think with this case, what I had understood is just how hard it is to be an individual who speaks up and holds a corporation account. Some of you may know I had the company end up spending nearly $150,000 to hire intelligence agencies and private investigators to follow me. I was facing litigation all along the way, and pretty much was constantly facing different subpoenas for different litigation cases for about 10 years. And it got to me. It got to me as I'd imagine it gets to anyone. It got to me in the bad way. In that moment that I said was the highlight of the trial, but it also mobilized me to think about how can we do better. There is the possibility that individuals can really take action and change the course of history, but we really need to orient and focus ourselves on how do we mobilize people around collective action, because some of these tasks are just too difficult for a singular person to bear. So not only was there impact sort of on me individually in my own life, what I saw there were huge impacts for all sorts of stakeholders that were affected by the collapse of Theranos. So to give you some context, largely who remains voiceless in these cases tend to be the people who are most deeply affected. So in this case, we're the patients. So in the case of Theranos, they had sold 1.5 million blood tests that yielded 7.8 million test results for 175,940 Arizona consumers. And it was expected of those tests, there was a 51.3% failure rate. So you don't know if this is for all the patients or some subset of the patients, but it was difficult to do those retrospective analysis because the company had destroyed the patient database in order to figure out who was affected by these cases. So there was huge impacts on the patients. There was huge impacts on the employees, not only myself, but other former employees. Theranos had effectively just used fear and silence to kind of prevent people from speaking up when they worked in the company and when they left the company. A lot of people during the trial sort of came forward and talked about how scared they were in terms of saying anything, even retrospectively about the organization. You had another whistleblower in the case, Tyler Schultz, who racked up about $300,000 in legal fees because of this case. And in a patent litigation, you had people like Ian Gibbons, who ended up taking his own life because of the fact that he could not handle the patent trial that was involved. So there are huge impacts in terms of the employees. And not only that, one of the things that was kind of sad for me, being an innovator, being a scientist, being someone who's more oriented towards translational medicine, taking things from research, putting it to the bedside, was you had a lot of loss of consumer trust for this diagnostic that I really cared about. And what I found funny is 10 years down the line, after the Theranos collapse, I'd seen this article in Stanford that said a Stanford lab had come up with this new device where with a finger stick of blood, you could run all your lab tests and it would tell you what your lab status was. And then of course I go and I look on Twitter and what do you see? Not again. Theranos, better have George Schultz's grandson confirm this first. So 10 years after this case had left, people still did not believe the possibility of point-of-care diagnostics, that it had that long of a chill effect on this industry. Also, another thing that you sort of saw is that sometimes you get much needed regulation, but you also see knee-jerk regulation. These cases and these collapses will end up having a scenario where they're big catalysts to have regulators move quickly, and sometimes that can come in direct contradiction to allowing people to create new innovations in the spaces. We saw this with molecular diagnostics. The FDA felt that they had to move in because you couldn't let another Theranos exist. And it may be the case that a lot of these microbiology labs are going to have a lot of issues coming up with new diagnostics in that space. So what did this teach me? Coming out of this case study, coming out of this big scandal, seeing things at the front lines and the consequences all along the way. And it really taught me that a lack of ethics hurts the overall ecosystem, making it difficult for everyone to succeed. People often say that when it comes to ethics and compliance, they sort of fall into it, and that was definitely my case. I never imagined that this would be the field that I would end up in, especially starting my career as a scientist, but now I'm starting to realize just how crucial of a field it is in order to make sure that we are able, especially as technologists, to ensure public interest and safety in the things that we engage with. So even in the case of Theranos, you saw investors get more risk adverse. You saw, of course, the company collapse. You saw the effect that it had on the employees, on the policy and government, and just completely destroys the public trust and consumer trust related to new technology products. So what can you learn from these cautionary tales, right? I know this is one case study amongst many others, but I wanted to kind of help sort of set the tone and sort of frame a lot of the ways that we're thinking about ethics now in this new region of AI, of how can we take this case study and break it apart about how we frame ethical challenges when it comes to new emerging technologies. So what kind of went wrong with this case? So there are different hypotheses. I'm a scientist, so of course I want to start off with a hypothesis. So in the Theranos case, was it a product hypothesis? Was it the case that the product was just false? It was just wrong, and that's why we saw the collapse. And I do think Theranos was a true case of the ultimate fake it till you make it culture and ethos. And what I tell people what Holmes did is that she promised everyone a flying magic carpet. She designed a hoverboard, and ultimately when she shipped those hoverboards, they exploded and caught on fire in people's homes. So she had managed to amass all this hype for this magical device that actually was incredibly dangerous once they decided to commercialize it and ship it. So was it a product failure? There's also the element of, is it a bad actor hypothesis? Is it just the leadership that caused this failure? Is it these two bad people who came over here, destroyed the company, and the possibilities of this new type of technology? And I think a lot of people will cite, is it some sort of dark triad trait? Are they sociopathic? What's kind of going on there? And I think one of the things when it comes to entrepreneurship that people need to pay attention to is that some dark triad traits are advantageous for things like entrepreneurship, but then there are others that are incredibly detrimental. Taya Cohen, who happens to be here, one of the things that they've seen in terms of someone's propensity to act more ethically is actually their guilt proneness. If you have someone who's on the spectrum that they don't feel guilt, then it's easier for them to likely engage in ethical activity. That might be a stretch, but at the same time, it's sort of a hypothesis. I think another aspect of this is, you're not always going to see these bad actors operate just because of greed. I don't think Theranos was just a case of trying to pocket as much cash as possible. There are other drivers that lead people to do these things and to act predatorily. It could be fame, it can be power, it can be control. So was this the reason for the collapse? Was it a bad actor, bad leadership? The sort of secondary hypothesis, it was an organizational problem. That ultimately there was something about the organizational culture that led to this collapse to happen. And I really appreciate this book by Marianne Jennings. I talk about it all the time. Effectively, what Marianne Jennings had done is she had deconstructed hundreds of these corporate collapses and tried to synthesize down what were the predictive factors that ultimately led these collapses to happening. And what she found is that there are a confluence of these type of indicators. So one was pressure to maintain numbers. In the Theranos case, we got a deal with Walgreens that forced us to commercialize in pharmacies all across Arizona. Fear and silence, we were constantly told that we signed non-disclosure agreements and they would pursue litigation. Youngin staff and bigger than life CEO, these are your cult of personality leaders who end up having very young staff that they're able to easily influence and who are ultimately being given responsibility that they probably don't have expertise in. A weak board. Theranos had a strong board in terms of fundraising with people like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, but a weak board in terms of people who could hold the organizational accountable based on the fact that they were a commercializable diagnostic product. Had conflicts of interest, probably not a great sign always that the CEO and the COO are dating, and and also that their lawyer is both their lawyer, their board member, and their investor. Probably not a great sign. Goodness in some areas, atoning for evil in others. Sometimes you can see people engaging in a lot of philanthropic activity as a way to morally license and hide some of the activity that's going on behind closed doors. This was very, very present in the Sam Bankman-Fried case. And this last point, which I found really surprising but really relevant to this community is innovation like no other. Often with these cases, what you see is they'll say, we are so innovative. We are in a class of our own. The basic rules of humanity and principles of the law, they don't apply to us because we're so paradigm shifting. And I think sometimes this is something to pay attention to when it comes to these new innovative companies, that it is often used as a way to circumvent basic principles of how things should be derived. Then there's, lastly, the systemic hypothesis. Was it the case that there was something about venture capital, there was something about the ecosystem in the Silicon Valley in 2013 when everyone was making a lot of money, all these acquisitions were happening, all of these companies were IPOing, that drove the company to the state that it was and allowed that to happen? You know, was it the hype? Was it the money? Was it the fact that people were scared of missing out, not on necessarily losing $10 million, but losing investing in the next Amazon and 60xing their investment? So you have this element here. I think something to pay attention to is, was this very similar to what we saw during the dot-com bubble, is what we saw in 2013. So in the dot-com bubble, what we saw, at least in the Valley, was there was a lot of overvaluations of companies, there was an abundance of venture capital, and the media was really trying to push companies to get big fast. And I think this is very similar to what we saw back in those 2010s, 2015s, when Bird, which was once touted as this great company that had been the first to reach the billion-dollar valuation fastest, ended up filing for bankruptcy not that long ago. So maybe some of the metrics that we're using for these success cases are not actually metrics of longevity. And these are things to pay attention to. So I think this really highlighted to me, if we're seeing history repeat itself, when does the cost of business doing cost too much? And I think that's a critical question that we need to ask ourselves. So, you know, a lot of people will ask, as I sort of highlighted, why did you do it? Why did you blow the whistle? Why did you get involved in this? And it's always been a sense of responsibility. It's always been, in the case of when I was working for a medical diagnostic company, for the safety of the patients that I was meant to serve. That it made all of the litigation, all of the 10 years of just chaos, all worth it. And I don't regret a single moment of it, because ultimately I knew I was acting in alignment with my sense of responsibility to the people that I committed to serve. And so this sort of kind of moved me into a new direction a little bit. I had seen sort of some of the failures with these revolutionary tech companies that came out in the 2010s. I'd worked in Hong Kong in venture capital and saw the worst parts of crypto and just tons of fraud. And then what was starting to make me increasingly concerned was I was seeing some of these same patterns be applied to a lot of these new wave of emerging AI companies. And I think AI will be a great technology that will provide a lot of value specifically for the healthcare space, but still that has to be met with a certain level of vigilance and caution, and that we don't sort of repeat the same patterns for this particular new technology. One of the things that kind of really sort of piqued my interest was there was a new alert from a lot of former employees for a lot of these major large language model companies. I do a lot of advocacy in the whistleblower space. I'm sort of intertwined into this world. And the fact that you saw a lot of former employees come forward and say, all we want from these companies is the ability to say something when we see something wrong. That's all we want. And that was very shocking to me, that seems a given, that you should be able to speak up when you see something that could be in direct threat of the public interest, but that's not what we're seeing happen. And sort of this too, which was the fact that a lot of people were starting to doubt whether or not ethical AI design would even be possible in the next 10 years. So these combined things sort of incited, again, that fundamental notion of responsibility. We have to start somewhere. We have to understand that we can shape our future through our actions and the responsibilities we take, but ultimately, I don't think that we should not do it alone. right? Having come from a space where I'd successfully been able to manage a state of accountability, one of the things I learned is we really need to figure out how to engage with collective action, because holding companies account as a solo figure, not a fun time, nor do I recommend it to anyone, and it just shouldn't be the way that we should be thinking about resolving some of this. And so this has really prompted the work that I do now, is really thinking about this. So how do we mobilize and bridge this gap between people's ethical intentions when it comes to new emerging technologies and the actual implementation of it? And how do we garner and empower the people who are really interested in mobilizing around that work to get the resources and the tools that they need in order to manage that effectively? And so as Taya said, this was kind of the genesis of why we started this series over at Carnegie Mellon, was to just get the conversation started, to sort of figure out where were people needing help, where were people's interests, where were people engaged. And then we, of course, contacted Elena to sort of continue that conversation, because I know a lot of you guys in this room come from an academic, a developer background, a business background of really thinking about what were the things that you guys needed to be able to sort of implement some of these principles and to sort of drive that movement. Additionally, this hasn't launched yet, again, nonprofit status, so we're scaling things up, but we're also building a professional association of responsible innovation professionals under risk, and that's sort of a big initiative. So a lot of the programs that I'm doing with the nonprofit is really thinking about that. How do we really mobilize the people who are getting into the weeds and trying to really foster responsible innovation and ethical AI implementation at this point? So with that, I'm excited to be here. I'm so grateful to everyone on the team who's helped put this together. I really encourage you guys, this is about collective conversation. Each of you guys has so much strength in your voices and what you can contribute to this new wave and this new movement. So really encourage everyone to share their thoughts in the breakout sessions and with people in this room. And thank you guys for your time.